Welcome, everybody. My name is Stephen Rothstein, and I'm the Executive Director of the John F. Kennedy Library Foundation. And on behalf of James Roth and all the colleagues at the library and the foundation, we are thrilled that you're all here and be doing this special event with the Boston Globe. Before we start, I want to briefly acknowledge the generous support for the underwriters of the Kennedy Library Forums, the Bank of America, the Lowell Institute, the Globe, obviously, Infinity, and BUR. And tonight, we especially appreciate Hyams Foundation for their work and appreciate their being here. In June of 1963, President Kennedy, in his address to the nation on civil rights, said in part, quote, "The heart of the question is whether all Americans are to be afforded equal rights and equal opportunities, whether we're going to treat our fellow Americans as we want to be treated. If an American, because his skin is dark, cannot eat lunch at a restaurant open to the public, if he cannot send his children to the best schools available, if he cannot vote for the public officials who will represent us, if, in short, he cannot enjoy the full and free life which all of us want, then who among us would be content to have the color of our skin changed and stand in his place? Who among us would be content with the counsels of patience and delay? By being here tonight, each of you have exhibited that you're not content, and we appreciate your being here and participating in this important discussion. The Boston Globe was not content when they wrote this very important Spotlight series. Join me to thank the Boston Globe. Each of the reporters you're going to hear from, the management that are here, the editors, all of them deserve a lot of praise and appreciation. In addition, you're going to hear from three amazing community leaders. Liz will introduce them more formally, but Tanisha, Tom, and DARRYL, they're not content, and we appreciate all the great work that they're doing each and every day. So now join me as we watch a very short film to begin tonight's program.
I just want to relax, turn my brain off, and watch the blackest city in America beat the most racist city I've ever been to.
Boston is the most racist sports capital. It just is. You talk to black players, hate that place, don't want to go up there.
Boston, and that last one is a real shame, because as I understand it, they only just got unracist yesterday. So, at least they could get to enjoy.
I
think Boston is racist.
No.
Short answer, yes.
Yes, there is some racism.
People might assume that.
We do have a lot of racism.
Certain people in Boston are racist.
Of course you're going to find that bad apple.
I don't think so at all.
You can definitely feel a kind of racist attitude.
Boston is a divided city.
You stay in your own neighborhoods.
Segregation.
You have like 80% Caucasian that runs the show up here, yeah.
I think there are racists everywhere. Every city, every state.
Any city has its problems, but I think it's more economics is what drives people.
We have a history, a somewhat dark history of intolerance.
Unfortunately, a lot of those things still manifest.
I'll just get like stares.
Microaggressions.
Someone can say something under their breath.
Racist kind of remarks when I go into certain stores.
If you go to Macy's, you know, you will be followed.
Somebody told me go back on the master's plantation.
Short answer, yes. Long answer, really complicated.
So speaking of not being content, Liz Walker, it's really a pleasure to welcome her as our moderator. Reverend Liz Walker is a senior pastor at the Roxbury Presbyterian Church. She was an ordained minister in the African Methodist Episcopal tradition and is a former journalist, and I've seen and worked with her all over the world. Join me to welcome our moderator, Liz Walker.
Thank you, Stephen, and good evening and welcome to all of you. First, I'd like to thank the Boston Globe and tonight's very special supporters, National Grid, Blue Cross Blue Shield of Massachusetts, the Boston Foundation, the Partnership, and John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum. Well, you saw it all in the video. The Boston Globe's 7-part series that examined the city's pervasive and persistent national reputation as a racist city is powerful. It has become a reference point for much comment and commentary here and around the country. Since launch, the Spotlight on Race series has sparked a growing number of public gatherings and an ongoing Facebook community with more than 3,500 active members. Over the next 3 months, the Spotlight team will moderate and act as panelists in more than 30 community events around the region. More evidence of a deep and expansive thirst to keep this conversation going. And that's what we're going to do tonight. The big question is, what's next? Where do we go from here? We will be joined by Spotlight team reporters and community leaders for this discussion. You all remember the series showed how $18 billion in public money went toward the Seaport District, a neighborhood that is virtually all white. As Boston builds out even more, how do we change the blueprint for our future? How does Boston become a more welcoming city for everybody? There are many questions tonight. If you have questions or comments or ideas during this evening's discussion, you can tweet them, you can post them to our Facebook group, Discussing Race in Boston, with hashtag Black in Boston, which is good on both Twitter and Facebook. I have no idea what I just said. But you know what I'm talking about. I'm old school, I'm sorry. I'm more the person who would understand that you can write out these questions on index cards, which will be passed out here, and you can pass those in, and we will answer those questions later in this event. We begin by introducing to you the Boston Globe Spotlight team. And I'm going to sit and introduce Patricia Wen, who is editor of the Spotlight team. And you can applaud, that's fine. You want to sit there, it's fine. Adrienne Walker, who was the Spotlight team's Race Project reporter. And Andrew Ryan, who is the Spotlight team's Race Project reporter. And before we begin the conversation, I'd like to give a shout out to the editor of the Boston Globe, Brian McGrory. Brian? So my first question is to you, Patty. What was the biggest challenge in your approach to this story? What worried you the most?
Well, I think clearly the thing that worried me the most was the idea that anytime you write about race, it's such an emotional topic. You know that there's just all these minefields. It's such a sensitive topic. Different communities, white, black, different minority groups are going to see this topic differently. So the biggest challenge was how could we write a series that would elevate the discussion and not get us into these sort of polarizing things. And that's why we, as you'll see, focused heavily on data. Each of the parts we decided had to focus heavily on data and statistics, and that this not be something that was driven by anecdotes or emotion. It had to be very tethered in data. Mm-hmm. So that was one of the key challenges.
I imagine the racial makeup of this team that's writing was important. How did you determine that? Was that difficult?
Well, we knew in forming the team that it had to be, people had to bring in lived experience, ideally. We had a racially diverse team. There were 6 reporters and myself. So in terms of race, we had 2 black reporters, 2 Asian, including me, and then we had 3 white reporters. So in terms of race, there was that. But also people brought in different expertise. You know, we had one reporter, she was the medical reporter, and she had that expertise. Andrew covered City Hall. Adrian's been covering, he's been a columnist for decades here. So people brought in also different levels of expertise, too.
Can white reporters really cover race? Was that a part of your discussion, Andrew?
I mean, I think white reporters have to cover race. I think we all kind of have to cover race. I mean, certainly I could never pretend to have experienced the same things that Adrian or Patty have, but I think that part of being a reporter is to try to, understand things, and that certainly race is a big part of that. And that doesn't mean that there are certain, our discussions as we were reporting this series and deciding what to cover and what not to cover, they were pretty fascinating because there were a lot of different points of view, and people came from a lot of different places. And so I think that was a really interesting part of the process.
Now, you answered this at the very beginning of this series, but a lot of people still might have missed. Why did you deal with black and white issues when there's so many different races in this city and so much racial disparity all across the board?
We talked about it at great length, and ultimately what we decided was we wanted to look at the root of Boston's reputation. And that really goes back to the black-white issue, and it goes back to busing. So, there was a lot of debate about whether, because we didn't do that to certainly minimize the experience of any other groups. Obviously that, the Latino population, the Asian populations have grown significantly in recent decades, but we really wanted to look at reputation and what the root of that reputation was. Mm-hmm. And, nationally, when you look at it both in terms of polling data and when you look at it just in terms of headlines and how people know Boston, it's the black-white divide that is really the thing that kind of is known across the country.
Adrian, for many people, one of the most stunning statistics from this report was the economic disparity statistic that pointed out the median net worth for African American households is $8 compared to $247,500 for white households. People thought they've got to be making that up. Yes. Where'd you get that statistic?
It was a jaw-dropping number. It comes from a 2015 Federal Reserve study called The Color of Change. And they did this study in, I believe, 5 other cities. And there were big disparities in all cities, but not at the level there was in Boston. Mm-hmm. And that number is just stunning. And as soon as we kind of came across it, we all, I think everybody's jaw dropped. And the significance of it to me is that economic disparity becomes the driver of so many other things. It becomes the driver of residential segregation. It determines where people live, where they play. It plays into everything else we wrote about.
Mm-hmm. This is such a huge subject, Adrian. What did you set out to do? What did you want to accomplish with this, from your perspective?
There were a couple of things we wanted to do. Sort of the original idea was the city has this image, this reputation, that it cannot shake. And part of the original premise was, does Boston still deserve it? It goes back to busing. Some would argue it goes back before that. But it's there. We just watched the video with Michael Che making fun of Boston a year ago. And we kind of wanted to see, does that image still conform to reality? And we found in many ways that it does. Mm-hmm. But also what we wanted to do was start a conversation, It's time to begin to really talk about this in a serious way. And if there's anything that I hope we have accomplished, it's exactly that.
I think the conversation has definitely started and goes on. Yeah. One of the people in the video said that it's complicated. And it is complicated, but how did you decide on the elements of the series?
That took a tremendous amount of discussion and a lot of that pushback, a lot of that, back and forth that we talked about before. We wanted to look at some of, Boston's kind of renowned institutions, what Boston is known for, and that led us to, education, that led us to healthcare. That led us to sports. We wanted to look at, Adrian and I have both spent a lot of time at City Hall, so we wanted to look at power. And Todd Wallach, who's also another reporter on the team, who spent a lot of time covering business, so we wanted to look at political power and business power. And then the Seaport came because it was a neighborhood it was kind of Boston's new neighborhood, and we wanted to, explore that kind of as a way to kind of look forward, as a way to kind of look ahead for how Boston could be in the future, because the city had an opportunity to basically create this new neighborhood that was largely laying fallow as parking lots, and so we wanted to explore what had happened and then what that could mean looking ahead to the next 10, 20, or 50 years.
I mean, actually, by the way, the Seaport story wasn't even on our sort of original list in terms of subjects, but when the extreme statistics became known, we decided it got pulled out as a separate story. So we sort of, as kind of a work in progress, too.
Let's talk a little bit more about the Seaport. Now, I read a lot of the reader responses. I couldn't believe how many reader responses you had. People really just had much to say about this. One reader said, it's a bit, quote, it's a bit disingenuous to imply that the Seaport was funded by taxpayer dollars when almost all of the money was spent to dredge the harbor and construct the Big Dig. So this $18 billion figure, I mean, where does that come from? Can you break it down in just general terms for us?
Sure. So what we did was we tried to quantify public investment, basically, in the neighborhood. And when you think about the Seaport and what really made it a fertile place for private development, which is what we're really seeing now. So, I mean, that does include a portion of the Big Dig, which is the portion that actually is called the I-90 extension that runs directly through the neighborhood. It's a tunnel that connects it to the airport. That makes it a very attractive place for business because there's easy access to the airport. But there's been tremendous other investment there. There's the Silver Line, there's the Convention Center, the federal courthouse. And that doesn't even include one of the big ones, which is cleaning the harbor. That if that water was, remember that was the water that Vice President George Bush called the filthiest harbor in America. I mean, if that was still true, I don't know if you could sell $1 million condos overlooking it. I mean, so it all kind of, I mean, all of those things together made it ripe for private development. And there's been, in addition to that, there's been, there were lots of other incentives, from everything from GE to Manulife to, the list could go on. So there's been, I mean, government has done a lot to basically make that a fertile place for development.
I mean, we all kind of saw the Seaport come together piece by piece, right, over the years, and it sort of started with the courthouse and then the convention center and all these public projects. I mean, that's how it went from being a bunch of parking lots to being the neighborhood we see today.
One of the things that struck me in reading all the reader responses, that people said, well, this is an economic issue. It's not a racial issue. Or some people said it's economic and racial. But one reader, or probably at least one reader, said, this is how America is set up. There's nothing special about Boston. It's just like any other city of, building developments based on capitalism. So why does Boston have a special, or does Boston have a special responsibility to a promise? Does anybody want to take that one, or should I preach on it? Because
yeah, you should.
Yeah, you should preach on it. Right?
Feel free.
Just make that one up. No, do you want to take that?
I'll take the first whack at this. There's a couple of things here. First of all, Boston has this reputation as this great liberal bastion, right? But when you look at who really runs the town, when you look at who holds power, when you look at who holds economic power, it doesn't live up to that reputation, right? So that's part of it. Boston is held to a higher standard, but it's held to a higher standard for good reason, And also, so there's also this sort of steady drumbeat of things that happen. I did the sports story, which was driven in part by the Adam Jones incident in Fenway Park last May when he was called the N-word while he was playing center field for the Baltimore Orioles. And there was a headline in the New York Times that said, "Of course, Boston." It just resonates here when it happens here in a way that it doesn't in other places.
Would you want to add?
I was going to say, and one of the things that we did was, as we were exploring reputation, that the Commonwealth Compact had done a poll. They had done 2 polls with Chadwick, Martin, and Bailey, and so they looked nationally at the perception of Boston by blacks and African Americans across the country, and compared to other major cities, Boston, for both those polls, finished last, as it was seen as an unwelcoming place. So the Globe had them do a 3rd poll, and they found the exact same statistics, that Boston again finished last. And this isn't, certainly Atlanta fared better, New York fared better, but even cities with smaller black populations like San Francisco were seen as more welcoming to blacks and African Americans than Boston.
Those are the statistics I think you have up there. And we basically asked the same research firm to conduct the same study, like we paid for it. because we thought, well, we should update these numbers now. I mean, is there still a perception among African Americans nationally that this is a city unwelcoming to people of color? Or is this just kind of perceptions or comedians saying this? But we thought these numbers were very telling.
Indeed, they are. Adrian, you've been quoted. Now, I'm going to tell you about this book because I read it recently, but it's a book that was written many, many years ago by Howard Bryant, Shutout, and you have been quoted in that book as saying Boston's African-American population has never been active enough to gain real political clout in this city to make changes, like changes in the Seaport. Do you stand by that? First of all, did you say that? And
yeah, I said it. Okay.
And do you stand by that? Is that still the reality now?
Yeah, I mean, I think lack of engagement has been a real issue. I think you see it when somebody like Tito Jackson runs for mayor, and how difficult it is to kind of solidify his base and to kind of achieve political power. Yeah, I think it is a real issue.
So we're going to, for the rest of the evening, are going to talk about where to go from here. But let's begin to talk about that now, if that's all right. What do you think are some of the solutions that you've gotten from doing this series, especially around issues of housing and Seaport kind of issues?
Well, I feel like, part 7 of the series, as many of you may know, dealt with solutions. And we deliberately had each reporter basically focus on one. But there's a real range, from really big solutions to more personal, you might say smaller ones. Because I think there was no simple way to decide how to address this. In terms of large solutions, there's obviously what companies can do, what they can do to bring in more diverse people into their pipeline, measurements, the Massport example, which you'll probably get into in the next session. But we also wanted to focus on things that are very personal so that you don't have to be like a public official or a big businessman or woman to make a difference. You could be, we had this, courageous conversations, how it is that each person can go about their life and confront issues where there's insensitivity. What you can do for your neighbor, for your coworker. We didn't want people to feel like you can only have kind of agency if you're sort of a big person in the community. That everyone can play a role.
That everybody has something.
Yeah, the nature of this is that it's not sort of a state house, city hall kind of problem. It is really a merger of both the political and the personal, and the solutions reflect that. The big picture and the things that go on in people's daily lives.
So we got an interesting email that I think we got just this week, right?
Yep.
And it was from somebody who runs as a senior softball league in Framingham and Wayland. And so they said that they read the series, and this is, I think, for people who ages like 50 to 80.
50 and over, yeah.
And they said that basically that they looked around and they realized that the ranks of their players were overwhelmingly white. And so that they, after they read the series, they decided that they were going to take steps to try to address that. So the first step that they took was that they were reaching out to Latino and black leaders to try to basically say, hey, how can we recruit more players so we can have a more diverse league? Which is a very small thing, but kind of a fascinating impact.
And I read about your Facebook group that's grown to 3,500. Right. They actually stay in community online. Exactly. Is that true?
There's been a number of meetups that have risen from that, and there are meetups like in Jamaica Plain, in Roxbury, in the suburbs, North Shore, South Shore, and this is very grassroots level. These are just people who decide through the Facebook group to meet up at a coffee shop, at a restaurant, and talk about issues around race. There, too, the Facebook group is not black and white. It's got every color in there. And people use it just to post articles that they want to share, and so forth. And that's been really exciting.
It's building community. Yeah. Does a story like this have a strong impact on you personally? I'm going to ask each of you this. How does covering a story like this change you, or what you think about the world, or what you think about yourself? I'll start with you, Patty.
Oh boy. I learned a tremendous amount doing this. For one thing, just being part of the team and working so intensely together. You share experiences, you realize how, I might look at a picture and I think it's fine, but let's just say, a reporter who's, white or black looks at the picture differently. I realize how we all bring in different life experiences. You know, I guess I would say, you know, when you were talking about the question of whether you can cover race if you're white, I mean, I think that, and this is probably, you know, obvious to many people, but maybe not. You know, white is a race too. You know, white is something. And until people see that, I don't, you know, it's not like racism is just about people of color. White is a race, and I think I began to see that and how the whiteness affects people's view of things, and I think that became even more clear to me in this series.
Okay, Adrian?
You know, one of the things we did in the series was we went around town to places and just counted. We went to restaurants, we went to sporting arenas, we went to places like that, and just counted the crowd, like the number of white people, the number of black people, right? So I'm a huge baseball fan. I go to Fenway Park all the time. You know, I go 15, 20 times a year. But Andrew and I go to Fenway one night, and we just stand at a gate and count. And 2,000 people walk through, and like 18 of them are black.
Wow.
And it had never hit me, and all these years ago in it had never hit me quite as hard. Like what a unicorn I am, sitting in the stands at Fenway Park. You know, part of how it affected me, I have to say, was that everything was a little worse than I thought it would be. You know? The racial isolation is worse than I thought it was. The economic disparity is a little worse than I thought it was. The number of black partners in law firms was smaller than I thought it would be. So, I mean, my takeaway was that we have even more work to do than I thought we did.
Okay.
And I'm going to piggyback on Adrian's a little bit. I mean, because we did a lot of counting, you know, and it was just kind of one of the shoe leather things that we did. And we did it at, you know, sporting arenas, we did it at museums, we did it just in public spaces. And, you know, like the reporters of color on our team would talk about, you know, how they would count. And that, as a white person, that's something I never did before. And once I started doing it, it was pretty fascinating just to go to the places that I spent time in the city and really, you know, really pay attention to how diverse they were. And whether that was, you know, you know, it could be the Common, it could be like Fenway Park, it could be just places I'm taking my kids. And I had begun counting even in restaurants and places like that. And it has made me more aware of kind of, you know, the circles that we all tend to travel in a little bit. You don't, I mean, you know, in some ways when you kind of turn off your reporting mind a little bit and you're just kind of, you know, going about your daily life. But now I don't think the counting, I don't think I'll turn off. It's pretty interesting.
You know, one Monday, a couple of weeks after the series ran, Patty came in and she said, I was in a restaurant Saturday night and I couldn't help myself. I counted the room. You know, it's like
a reflex. Yeah, right.
So that's something that just like hit all of us.
And if you see more than 5 African Americans, you get up and go shake their hands and just
well,
say
there were
how
3 black
happy.
people at Grill 23 the night I counted, and 2 of them were together. So when they left, you know, it was like.
You know, and we you know, we make jokes about this, but it's a sad state of affairs, and it is important to talk about it. So I thank you. You guys are going to come back, and we're going to talk more. But right now, we're going to invite some other people to join us. So thank you very much. Let's give a big hand to our reporters. You did a great job. We wanted to make sure that we gave everyone a time and platform to speak. So I'm going to introduce some of our community and business leaders now who are participating in tonight's conversation. Tanisha Sullivan is the president of the NAACP Boston branch with one of the largest memberships. With one of the largest memberships in New England and a legacy of committed service, the NAACP Boston branch is a leading voice on issues of racial justice and diversity, accountability in policing, economic opportunity and development, and public education. And Tanisha is a dynamic and committed change broker. So welcome.
Thank you.
According to a recent national report by the Economic Policy Institute, this was in, I think, the Washington Post yesterday, there's been no progress at all in home ownership, employment, incarceration for African Americans in the 50 years after the historic Kerner Commission report on racism. I didn't read deeply into it. I don't know if it's data-driven. I assume it must be. But this report says in some cases African Americans are worse off nationally. How do you see this problem? It's bigger than just Boston, of course.
Absolutely, it's bigger than just Boston. But I think it speaks to, particularly in the Boston context, political and economic isolation. And though we have seen, and I think Adrienne referenced it in the earlier panel, although I think we've seen progress, particularly here in the city of Boston, we are still lagging when it comes to economic inclusion and political inclusion. And we cannot devalue the power that exists in both of them. I'll give you an example, right? When we think about places like Atlanta, for example, where there is a relatively vibrant and robust African-American Black community, where we've got thriving Black businesses, we have elected officials in prominent roles across the city, there has been great intentionality in those communities to be inclusive. And so I think, particularly when we see what's happening here in the city of Boston, I think we're ripe for progress, but we need to be a little bit more intentional when it comes to economic and political inclusion.
Okay, thank you. We're going to talk more with you. Right now I want to introduce Tom Glenn. Tom Glenn became Chief Executive Officer of the Massachusetts Port Authority on November 1st, 2012. With many years of executive experience, Glenn has led organizations in both the public and private sector. And I think that what is so amazing is all the work that you have done on diversity in Massport, and we certainly appreciate that. My question to you, the Globe started its segment on the Seaport District with the headline, "Boston had a rare opportunity to build a new neighborhood for all Bostonians. Instead, it built the Seaport." From your perspective, is that fair? Is that a fair statement?
Well, it's a very big statement. I agree. I think that, there are probably, as we look back, opportunities that were missed. One of the original notions that Governor Dukakis and Fred Salvucci had when he was secretary for the Silver Line was it would be continuous from Dudley to the Seaport. And then as a result of some controversies that took place along the way, it now has kind of two loops. So it was really originally envisioned as something that would really provide a kind of gateway to the new job creation area in the Seaport, for all of Boston. So, that was, I think, a missed opportunity in a sense as we look back. I think you could say, although we're very proud of what we did at Massport with the Omni project, maybe we could have moved a little earlier, maybe that was a lost opportunity. I think it's tricky when you look at the history of the Seaport going back in the 80s and early 90s. You had Mr. Johnson and John DeRue kind of as pioneers, and then there was a period where Mayor Medina was kind of creating the Innovation District. But in those days, it was hard to get people to even think about that as a location. And then I think coming out of the recession of 2008, all of a sudden there was a lot of interest in the area. And that's when I think the public agencies have an opportunity to kind of leverage and say, we want you to do something that really includes everybody. And, I think Dwayne Jackson, who many people here know, was one of our board members, along with John Nucci, who was also here. He was the one who really stepped up and said to us, this is an opportunity that you have, and don't let it go by. So, I think that probably along the way, there are some things that could have been done, but it did change pretty rapidly in terms of where the leverage was from the private and the institutional to the public.
You mentioned access, and the plan was to have the Silver Line from Dudley straight into this area, correct? Right. Mm-hmm. So was that, could you just kind of tell us how that happened? I mean, was it a conspiracy? Was it, no, we don't want Black people to come down here? Or why did that not happen? Could you be more specific?
I can. It really had to do with kind of downtown issues and the disruption that would take place to build the Silver Line continuously. Again, you have to go back and put things in context. So the big dig is happening, on one side of the city, and are going to be able to, tear up a big section of downtown at the same time. So I think it was really driven by the abutters. It wasn't driven by any larger concern that I'm aware of.
So it just sounds like there was no vision for the inclusion that would be necessary. And I'm not trying to put anybody on the spot, but that's what it sounds like.
No, I don't feel on the spot that much. Well, I think the vision actually was there. The implementation was, I think, kind of where things shifted around. But I think if we had to do over again, maybe we'd make a different set of decisions as a civic community, not any, kind of one individual or one institution. But it turned out to have been a big decision, given all the development that has now taken place, in the Seaport.
Okay. Joining our conversation now is DARRYL Settles. DARRYL is a Boston businessman and entrepreneur with a 25-plus year career marked by significant contributions to hospitality, real estate, and development industries. DARRYL is also a board member of the Black Economic Council in Massachusetts, which advances the commitment to promoting, creating, and preserving cultural diversity and equality in an urban environment. So DARRYL, my first question is, I understand that BECMA, Black
Sure.
Economic Council, had a conversation not unlike this just last night.
Just last night at the Federal Reserve Bank, we had about 350 participants.
So this conversation is very powerful, ongoing. What was one of the takeaways? You were working on solutions there, correct?
That's correct. We're actually presenting solutions that actually work. And first, I just want to thank the Globe and Greg for doing this, because I think that you guys did a unbelievable task of taking the blinders off so many people. And so I think that many of you have heard me say that, no one can look you in the eye today in a reputable way and say it's not as bad as we thought it was, or you're exaggerating. And so it opens it up to conversations. And so I know of 9 events that are like this that are happening. 4 have already happened and 5 more are. And I think what's great about it is the audience. The audience is different. You have, like even here, you have young whites who are 30s and 40s and early 50s. And the past history of Boston has been that most of the people at the table have been older, who are not about diversity, and not that they are being racist, it's just that it's not part of their background.
Mm-hmm.
And so you talked about the solutions that we have. We talked a lot about what Tom has done. And I want to acknowledge that Tom is a leader, and he was willing to take the risk. So between Tom and Jim Rooney from the Convention Center, they made this happen. And about the Seaport, being what it is, I think the biggest problem is there were no brown people at the table. That's what the problem was. There were no brown people at the table. And our government, both from the city and from the state, the leadership did not make it an issue. And so I think there was a void there that the conversation never happened. And so the other thing that came out of last night was that, the private sector, if there's a golden nugget that's out there that can make a difference overnight, it's the private sector changing how they do business. And an example was presented last night, and it had to do with the hotel that you guys, that's being built soon. John Mariotti and Associates and Greg Janey from Janey Co. are doing a partnership to build that hotel. And the partnership is 70-30. I don't know of another deal in the history of Boston that's been like that. That's a game changer. So Greg Janey is a good friend. He's going to hire a lot of black subcontractors who are going to make money from this deal. He's going to be sitting at the table and seeing how big deals are done. And John, they did a little TED Talk last night, and John said, in 5 years, I want Greg to come to me and say, you know what? I'm not going to do the next deal with you. I'm actually going to compete with you for that deal. Mm-hmm. And that's what we need. We need big players here in the city. We need brown businesses that are doing well. I was at the Seaport on Sunday night for dinner, meeting with a big player over there, and we talked about, who's there. I mean, the Seaport is unbelievable. There got to be at least 40 restaurants that are there. And it was active, and there were brown people in the Seaport on Sunday night. But there's only one business. There are 2 minority businesses there that I'm aware of. One is a barbershop that's owned by a friend of mine, and it's 300 square feet. And the other is a large Latino restaurant that has about 400 seats. Those are the only 2 that are over there. But if you look at how much economic output and input that's happening over there, It's tremendous, but it's not touching the black community.
Is it too late? Is there space now for
There's
those
space
small
now.
businesses?
There's several new
or-
projects that are coming up. You know, Mass Mutual has a new project that's coming up. It was someone on the panel last night said from the state level that there are 4 more parcels that are coming out, and they're probably going to use the same model that Tom and his group did. And Tom, you may want to talk about that model of how there were 4 different attributes to the RFP, and they were all equally graded with 25%, and 25% of it is having a diverse team from the beginning to the end.
Mm-hmm. So, Tom, could you tell us a little bit more about that?
So, historically, we would have a 100-point scale, and they would be divided up among design and finance and the ability to execute. So, as Darryl saying, we decided to kind of change that up. So we said, well, there's going to be 4 criteria, equally weighted. So finance, design, ability to execute, and diversity. And so it put a high premium on the diversity component. The 3 finalists that we selected all had very strong components. And so I think it was a good validation that the market will respond if you set the ground rules, correctly. Because it wasn't just this project. There were 2 other projects that also stepped up on this criteria. Sometimes there's been a confusion that we said 25% of the project had to be diverse, but we didn't say that. We said of a 100-point scale, 25 points went to diversity. Sure. You had to show us what you were going to do in all the different dimensions, as Darryl said and as Dwayne had recommended.
Tanisha, is that enough?
So, is it enough? No. However, I do want to echo Darryl's comments. I'll tell you, I've heard so much about Tom. This is my first time meeting him this evening, and everything I've heard about him is incredibly positive in the business context. And what has been most compelling to me about what's happened at Massport, beyond certainly being able to actualize some real results, is truly the story around intentionality that comes when people talk about Tom Glenn. Because as the story has been told, it was, an idea. Right, Dwayne Jackson and others, it was an idea, it was a what if, is this, how can we make this happen? And Tom, you were sitting in the decision-making seat and you said, let's just make it happen. And that's incredibly powerful. And I think, as I've been in conversations around this city, all too often, we drag our feet on issues like this. We put up all of the reasons why something is not possible, or it's not the right time. We need to slow this thing down. But the story that I believe really needs to be told is one of intention. And so I appreciate your example in that space as well. I say that there's more to be done because while certainly there is a need for us to have more economic inclusion, as I mentioned before, and I understand the pivotal role that businesses of color play in helping to bring about greater economic prosperity in our communities. I also think it's important for us to be mindful that we have a struggling middle class and we have poor folk in our city who are just trying to figure out whether we're talking about the Globe Spotlight series around access to health care, or we're talking about the Globe installment, talking about access to higher education. We've got some real issues that are impacting people's day-to-day lives around access. And so I think we've got to work both, right? Certainly focused on economic development and empowerment and inclusion, but also being focused on those bread and butter issues of, making sure that young people have access to high quality education. And if you are a young person residing in the city of Boston, there should be absolutely no reason why you don't have access to some of these fine institutions that call Boston their home. And it was troubling to me to read the Globe Spotlight series installment on colleges and universities and to learn just how much we have regressed when it comes to the access that Black young people have to our institutions of higher learning. And so I do think there's more that, that can be done. While we celebrate the success and build on the success, we still have to keep striving for more.
Mm-hmm. One of the criticisms that I hear, not only in Boston but in other urban areas, is that the racial economic progress of any city is kind of connected to the anger and moral outrage of communities of color. So how would you assess Boston as far as the demand for this? I know you are talking about it, but across the African American community, do you think that there's moral outrage and anger enough?
I think there's moral outrage, but I also think there's some level of resignment. I think that in resignation to kind of where we are, and on some level, I think some hopelessness. And that for me is deeply troubling. Because again, we have so much capacity and so much opportunity here in this city. We're just rich in resources, and yet there are communities, whether we're talking about Roxbury, we're talking about East Boston, we're talking about parts of Dorchester, that just don't feel the movement, the prosperity, and are wondering who cares. And so I do believe that it is incumbent upon those of us who sit in rooms like this or sit in boardrooms to be ever mindful that it's not just about those who already have access, those who are already sitting in the room, but it's about the people who are not in the room. Mm-hmm. And so making sure that we're being intentional about our inclusion in a holistic way, being courageous to ask the question, who benefits from this? Mm-hmm. And if it's just simply the people who are in the room and the people who are connected to the people in the room, then we've got to be willing to put the brakes on some things. If we're truly going to realize our full potential as a community, as that city on a hill that I hope we're all aspiring to be.
Mm-hmm. Liz, can I add to that?
Please.
I think that I want to state that I think the anger is warranted. And let me tell you why I say that. I say that because there are not enough brown people with meaningful jobs in the city of Boston. They are not. When you go to downtown Crossing, you go to the Seaport, you go to the Back Bay, go to Copley Square, anytime between 7:30 in the morning to 9 a.m., and from 3 o'clock until 6:30 in the evening, you count how many professional brown people you see walking back to the parking lot or to public transportation. They're not there. The majority of the brown people that are working in downtown Boston have retail jobs or hospitality jobs. And those are not, I mean, they're jobs, but they're not meaningful jobs for us to participate like one of the reporters said earlier. If we don't have the money, we can't go into the nice restaurants. We don't have money, we can't buy the nice clothes or go into the nice retail stores. So there's anger there, and it's only going to grow unless we wake up as an entire community to say there's enough for everyone. And I want to highlight one particular organization. I mentioned earlier about the private sector is everything. I had coffee with the general manager of WeWork last week. And I'm going to announce this because he said it was okay to announce this. On January 1st of this year, they started a new program within the company that they were doing just in the East region of the WeWork organization. And it is using the Rooney Rule for every job opportunity. So whether you are a part of the cleaning crew, or whether you're part of the marketing team or the CFO, no one can hire someone unless a person of color has been through that interview process. That's a game changer. So his goal was not to announce this until around the April timeframe, but he has seen so much, so many wins already in 7 weeks that he's going to announce it very soon. But that's a game changer. That's worth the clap because that is one leader thinking about his company as he travels around the world and after he read the Globe series, because that was part of it, you know, reading that series. And he said that, you know what can I do? What can I do? And he went back and called an immediate meeting of his senior staff and laid down the rule. It wasn't a conversation. It is, this is what we are going to do.
Okay, were you going to add to that?
I was just going to add that I do think in that space there is a lot for us to learn from the private sector. Again, you know, the private sector tends to be more, I think, forward thinking and taking a quicker action than we are in the public sector when it comes to these issues. And, you know, whether it is thinking about having a diverse slate for women and people of color when it comes to making hiring decisions, or when it comes to making the decisions about, from a supplier diversity standpoint, where corporate dollars are going to be spent. I do think there's a lot for us to learn from what's happening in the private sector that could be incredibly powerful in government. And so I'm hopeful that whether we're talking about on the city level or even on the state level, that we'll see more of the best practices that are working in the private sector to help see some of the same advancements in government.
In my neighborhood where I preach, I get the sense of hopelessness that you speak to. Now, I am in a neighborhood where there are a lot of poor. I mean, how does all of this get to my neighborhood? How does WeWork, because we don't have a WeWork that I know of in Roxbury. So how does that hope that you're talking about translate to my neighborhood? Or how, because it's a gap. There's a big gap there.
Well, you know, someone used the word complicated earlier. You know, it is complicated because, you know, I'm in the hospitality business, and over the last 25 years, I've had, you know, thousands of workers. But there's a market there that, because they don't see how they can get on the other side of the bridge, they don't shoot for it. You know, they don't have many people in their families that are on the other side of the bridge, so they don't even think about it. But once you start seeing more professional brown people in downtown Boston, and once you see more scaled minority businesses downtown, people's dreams will get bigger. You know, you can't have a dream unless you actually have seen it. You can't have a dream unless you know someone who's living that dream. And that's where we fail here in Boston, because there are not enough examples of the dream.
Well, so I need to push a little bit on that because I do believe that it's important for us to be able to see models of success, but I don't believe that they all have to be downtown. The reality is you can walk into Dudley Cafe on any given morning and you can barely find a seat. And so there is certainly a need for a call for a space like a WeWork. The challenge is for us to be more intentional about saying, you know what, we want this here. One, and then two, holding businesses accountable for actually coming into our neighborhoods, whether we're talking about Dudley or we're talking about parts of Hyde Park or East Boston. There is a thirst and a desire to have what downtown has, and we don't always have to think about going downtown for what's good, because what's good is in our neighborhoods too.
Yeah. So
the other piece is, I also think that there's a very real opportunity for us as a community to also decide that as we are trying to attract some of these major corporations into this wonderful city, into this commonwealth, that we be a little bit more creative about where we're directing them and where we're asking them to put warehouses and distribution centers so that we can get to a space where people can live and work in their neighborhoods and have meaningful work and earn a living wage in their neighborhoods. And that too will help to alleviate, we haven't even gotten to it yet, but the very real gentrification challenge that we have here in the city of Boston that is disproportionately impacting people of color.
Yeah. So I think we're talking the same thing, and you mentioned earlier your neighborhood. We're talking about the same neighborhoods. You're right up the street from Dudley. And you know, I've been watching development there for the last 15 years. Dudley has been promised to make it for how many years? 25, 30 years, and it hasn't made it. And so you mentioned Dudley Cafe, and I know the owner of Dudley Cafe, and you know, he is busy, but it's still a challenge. And we had the new school headquarters that opened up in Dudley 2 years ago. 4 businesses opened there, 2 have closed already. And so Dudley is a challenge, and so I'm saying, and we're not talking differently, I'm just saying that we need more people to have money in their pockets. And I want to remind people that I was in Dudley once before. I had a place called Bob's Express there about 18 years ago. And I opened it, and I thought I was doing the right thing, and it was the right thing to do. But the problem was the people that were in Dudley, which is a busy center, didn't have money in their pockets. And we were serving meals for $10, and everybody else was serving meals for $5. And so there was a disconnect there. And so we have to find a way that we can put real discretionary money into brown people's pockets. And that was my point. So we're on the same page.
And indeed, it is all very complicated. Let me just ask you a very personal question. Tanisha, I'll start with you. We can talk about this on a systemic level. We can talk about all the things we've discussed. But how do you feel about living in a city that has such a horrible reputation when you talk to your friends in other parts of the country? Are you the pioneer who's going to change it? Are you embarrassed? Or do you just not tell anybody you're from Boston?
So, you know, my life story is inextricably linked to this city, right? My great-grandparents are from Boston, lived in Boston, my grandparents, my parents, so there's no shaking it. And the truth is that I love this city. And the truth is that whether it's the NAACP AXO program, participating in it as a young person and then being exposed to just the brilliance of Black youth, or it's participating in Sportsman's Tennis Club, you know, as a youngster, or the Inroads program or the partnership, this city has presented me with a lot of opportunity. And for that, I'm hopeful. Because as I sit here, yes, I'm the president of the NAACP Boston branch, but I'm also an attorney from Boston College. My law degree is from Boston College. I have an MBA from Boston College. I'm a corporate lawyer in the biotech space. So that just doesn't happen overnight. And I say that not to like pat myself on the back, but the reality is I would not be sitting here but for the opportunities that this city has provided to me. And so I am very proud of being from this city. And I'm hopeful about the opportunities that exist not only for me, but for other people in this city. My work is really about expanding those pathways, expanding access, expanding opportunities, so that I'm not like Adrian said, I'm not a unicorn. I want to be the norm. And so that's what this work is about for me.
Okay, I think you said it. You go ahead, girl. With that, I think we're going to invite our journalists back to join us. Are they ready to come back? And we're going to start taking questions that you have put to us. We are joined by Todd Wallach, who is the data journalist. I call him the data king, because for me, that's what made this report so different from all the others that I have seen in my lifetime on issues of race. The numbers indeed. So we're going to take our first question from the social media, online. That's what I was told before we got to these questions. Is that still? There it is. What are some ways reparations for slavery and continued racist practices can be made? This is from the Facebook group. Who wants to take that question? I love the way it's framed. It's just, anybody? Okie dokie.
So I will. All right. So I will comment on this, and I think, but I'm going to start this way. I think one of the things that is critically important for us as a community to be willing to do is just to, acknowledge that racism exists, right? And to start there and acknowledge that there are, from an institutional standpoint, there are the vestiges of slavery are still very prevalent in our community. And that doesn't mean that, that we're calling people racist, right? But to start with from a point of just acknowledging and owning the history that we have when it comes to slavery and institutional racism, I think is critically important. I think from the standpoint of how do we move past this, I think it comes back to being intentional. You'll hear me say this over and over and over again. We have to be intentional about our inclusionary practices. To me, it is just, it's heart-wrenching that, not to take it back to the seaport, but to take it back to the seaport, it's heart-wrenching that we had this wonderful opportunity to create this inclusive neighborhood in the city of Boston, and we didn't just miss the opportunity, we just kind of blew it off. And so we have to be more intentional as a community in making sure that something like that doesn't happen again. And so when we as a community see things like that, we as a community have to be courageous in calling it out. And if that means that we're stopping things in their tracks, then so be it, because we want better for all of us.
Tom, do you want to respond to Andrew?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think there has been some progress in the last, say, 10 years on this question of big institutions. I think of Brown University, Andrew Ruth Simmons, and Princeton with Brent Henry, kind of looking at their history and their relationship to slavery and acknowledging it. I don't think you could say it goes all the way to monetary reparations, but I think it has been acknowledged and become part of people's understanding of how those institutions came to be what they are. So I think that's a step, but it doesn't go all the way. I think that the questioner is suggesting, but I think it's much better than it was, say, 20 years ago, when these big institutions didn't necessarily acknowledge, how they had come to be and the role that slavery had played in.
Absolutely.
creating.
Every once in a while, you'd see an article where some big institution or someone is saying that they admit that part of their history.
Well, the Times has done these great stories about Georgetown and how it was saved early in its history by selling enslaved people, And it's become a conversation people are willing to have, unlike 20 years ago when it was often sort of consigned to a fringe. And I think that change is very healthy. What the next step is, I don't know.
And there are ways, particularly when we talk about some of our colleges and universities, so, thinking about ways in which there can be grants and scholarships that can be given to young people who are descendants of those who were enslaved. There are ways in which our institutions, whether it be the banks that were built on the backs of slavery, can be more thoughtful about how they lend money or the way in which they engage communities of color. Reparations is not a bad word, okay? And in many ways, we see here in the city of Boston ways in which our companies and our nonprofit institutions try to give back to communities of color every day. I just think, again, it's about being intentional about where we're putting money, where we're investing dollars, and being mindful that there are communities, specifically the Black community, that is still feeling, again, the vestiges of slavery every day. And so that's where equity comes into play. That's where we are being ever mindful of the ways in which we can lift communities of color, specifically the Black community, recognizing that for many of us, we don't have trust funds. And for hundreds of years, our parents, our grandparents, our great-grandparents worked for free. So I do think that there are ways in which we can do this.
It's really a conversation about how you level the playing field. And it goes back to that number in the first day of the series, that 247,500 versus 8, right? I mean, it's really the same issues, the same question. And how do you address that inequity?
part of the issue, and I understand, I love the idea that you guys dealt with data. That was the only way to do it. But the other part of this is the pain that comes with this conversation, at least for some of us. There's a lot of pain for me. I would rather not talk about race based on where I came from out of Arkansas, with getting spit on, and I still get a twitch. I don't go home. I really have issues with Little Rock because I've never resolved the pain of this. I don't think I'm alone. I think I'm admitting it, but I don't think I'm alone. So where does that fit in? I'm not sure that the systemic answer is going to get to that part of it, or is it? Anybody want to take that? I'm looking at you because you're such a good...
Me?
Yeah. Do you think? I mean, because you know what I'm talking about.
I do. You know, hey, listen, we have to be willing to have real conversations, and conversations where, you know, I can be free to talk about the pain that I'm experiencing, that I've experienced as a little black girl. Going to, you know, a predominantly white school where, you know, it wasn't necessarily okay to be the smart black girl. There's pain that comes with that.
Of course.
And so we have to be willing to have real conversations, move past the polite conversations, be inclusive in those conversations, and not be defensive. And I think part of our challenge has been, as we've tried to have these conversations in and around the city, we're a little bit too polite. We don't want to offend. And we want to show on some level, you know, we want to be gracious because we have received so much from this city. And I would submit that we can be appreciative of what the city has given to us, and we can love the city while at the same time challenging the city to be better. And in challenging the city to be better, we must allow people to be authentic in sharing the pain, the very real pain that they're experiencing.
Great.
One thing I was going to say that relates to Boston, and what surprised me in the reporting of this is, you know, the number of people. I mean, I talked to this one man, he's a lawyer, he's black, he's in his mid-50s, and he had such painful memories of Boston, speaking about emotional reactions, such painful memories of being in Boston around the busing time and feeling that there just was, you know, racial slurs, certain neighborhoods were off limits. And it struck me too, he doesn't want to go back to Boston, doesn't like coming back here, even if it's for a reunion for law school, whatever. It was interesting for me, and when you talked about things that we learned, how those memories are enduring. We were asked to speak at the MIT Business School, and one of the women, she was in charge of the Black Student Association, and she talked about how her father was like, why would you want to go to school and graduate school in Boston? Why would you want to do that? And I thought it was just interesting, again, this kind of, I mean, speaking about how this feeling is particular to our city and how these kinds of word of mouth things just linger. And I guess there I'm talking about the power of that kind of emotion.
Right.
You know, one of the things we wrote about in the series, particularly in the first day by Akilah Johnson, is sort of the sense of isolation so many black people feel in the city, particularly black professionals. And, you know, one of the things we got to come to terms with, you know, we talked about things the business community can do and all of that, is how painful that sense of isolation is. And, you know, it's one of the reasons you don't have a bigger black middle class. It's one of the reasons people don't stay, right? And don't feel comfortable. And this is, you know, it's not so much data-driven as emotional, but it's really a core issue as the city begins to try to come to terms with race in Boston and what it all really means and how it plays out in people's daily lives.
Great, okay. Here's another question from our audience. Why didn't you, this is to the Globe, why didn't you devote a section to police brutality or police relations with the... Did you discuss it?
Well, we certainly discussed it at length, and then we discussed a lot of different things to focus on. And one of the things that we wanted to do was to look at things that weren't being looked at. And we felt that, I mean, that not that, you know, law enforcement issues weren't valid issues, but the Globe has written a lot about those issues, and quite frankly, a lot of other media organizations had also been exploring those for several years, especially in the wake of Ferguson and other places around the country. And so this wasn't to say that that wasn't a valid story to write, and it doesn't mean that we're not going to keep writing about that issue. But we also wanted to look basically in places where people weren't looking.
Anybody else? How can people not on Facebook get involved in a community conversation or meetups or be a part of the ongoing talk about this? Anybody have any ideas there? How can older people be involved?
Older people
Well,
are on Facebook.
They can come to events like this one.
Right. Well, we are talking about, there's so many forums that we have been invited to that are open to the public, and we are in the process of talking about a way to at least let those be known to people. I mean, that's one way, and so far we haven't really broadcast that, but yeah.
I think a lot of people are looking for ways to have and to continue this conversation, and that isn't all going to be driven by social media. It's going to be driven in people's communities.
And you could demand it too in your community or your church or your social organization.
Absolutely. I mean, you don't have to wait for someone else to create the community. You can create the community where you are. It's just a matter of, you don't have to have a room of 500 people. A kitchen table of 4 can make a world of a difference. That's what the civil rights movement taught us, right? So to the extent that you're interested in these conversations, I would suggest start with you and your friends and invite people over for breakfast, lunch, or dinner, and just start the conversation. Start it where you are and don't wait for somebody else to do it for you.
Good idea. Here's a great question. And I'm going to ask each of you this, and you can take a moment to think about it. What do you think should have happened with the Seaport neighborhood? What's your kind of dream of the perfect kind of neighborhood there? Utopic neighborhood, diverse. What could have been done?
I think this is a great question for Tom Glenn.
Tom?
That wasn't fair.
I knew my positive reviews would only last so long. But I appreciate it as long as it lasted. So, I think that I touched a little bit on this, when I talked before. I think that as the public agencies could have moved a little sooner. I think that we could have made this more of a focal point in the thinking about it. Again, the notion was, for much of the time that the Seaport vision was being developed, how to create a new economic engine for the city, how to stay contemporary in technology and in life sciences, and it happened a lot faster. So, I think that the housing issue probably could have been resolved in a more positive way, I don't know. I think that the work that we're doing, it was referenced by DARRYL. So we have 3 additional parcels in the pipeline that Jim Doolin and Ken Turner are working on that we're going to do the same kind of scoring, and that will also produce, I think, more energy around this agenda. Some of that will be residential. Obviously, the hotel isn't a residential project, so maybe that will, increase the diversity of the folks who want to live there. But we're behind in terms of really creating a neighborhood that appeals to all parts of the city. But I think there are things that can be done. I think one of the interesting things about our experience is, as was referenced, I'm glad that DARRYL mentioned Jim Rooney. So when I called Jim Rooney to talk about this, because originally this was going to be a joint project, I'm not exaggerating, it took maybe 20 seconds for him to agree. And when we went to the board, I mentioned John Nucci, Dwayne, it took 10 seconds. I mean, people just thought it was the right thing to do. So I think there's an appetite for change. We just, as we talked about, we just have to put some things on the table for people to react to. So I'm a little bit more optimistic, maybe, than some others.
Okay. So one thing I wanted to add about the Seaport was, one of the reasons we looked at the Seaport was because we wanted to look ahead. Because, there's a lot of seaports coming up, and they might not be quite as big, but there's a lot of swaths of land, inside the city and beyond where there's tremendous development opportunities. And so there are things that can, you think about Whitehead Circle, where there was going to be the Olympic Stadium. That's a big plot of land that they're talking about developing. When they straighten the Mass Pike, that's going to open up a big plot of land. After this series came out, we got a call from somebody who was in, I think in Alston, where they were involved on a steering committee for a major thing that Harvard is doing. So these major things are still happening. I mean, Boston is still being shaped. So one of the reasons that we wanted to focus on the seaport was basically to raise these issues, and because there's new things to do now. You know, there are new places to focus about, and there's questions to be asked as these things take shape, because they're very much in kind of the early stages.
You know, when you talk to people who are involved in the sort of evolution of the seaport, and you say, we built this whole new neighborhood from scratch, basically, in the last 20 years. And how did it become this? The big answer you get is, we never really thought about it.
Right.
You know, to go back to Tanisha talking about intentionality, you know. And one of the great lessons of the seaport is, we need to start thinking about it. You know, as we develop Austin Brighton, as we develop by that circle and whatever else is coming, you know, the big lesson of the seaport is we need to start having the conversations we didn't have 10 years ago.
I think another thing that can't be repeated is when it comes to housing. Tom mentioned housing earlier. So the city allowed, and it wasn't this mayor, but allowed the affordable housing to be built off the property, away into other neighborhoods. And so when I was at the seaport this past Sunday night in Strager, there were 8 people in the room that I knew, and I think one is here.
You want to have that person stand up?
No, but 4 of them live in the same building right next to Strager, and you know, everyone's successful. And you know, Tanisha mentioned earlier, I love Boston. I've been fortunate. I'm lucky, and so it's been good for me. But the people who are there, who are living there, they're all you know, in their 50s or 60s or 70s. They're pretty much semi-retired or retired if they wanted to be, and it's just that they have more money to burn. 4 of them had started at brunch at 11 a.m. and they had bar hopped all day, and this was at 7 o'clock at night. And they were still partying, and we were all joking about, this is what they do every Sunday. So it's an environment that most of us never participate in. And so I just think that, you know, as we built the rest of the seaport out, we got to think about what New York is doing. When New York builds a new block or a new building, they make sure that it's mixed housing. And so we need to make sure that going forward, that none of that affordable housing, and you know, some people can argue what's affordable, but that it is a mix of incomes that are living on the seaport. That's very, very, very important.
And we should add, so the last major Seaport Square, which was just approved at the end of last year, they did require all affordables to be built on site. So that was and I don't remember the exact number off the top of my head, but it was a pretty significant number.
So that's does that denote a change or just that group?
Well, that's a change because, as Darryl said, they used to be.
No, but I mean, does that mean that the rest of them are going to do that?
We'll have to see what City Hall does.
Right. Yeah. And I think I do want to go back to something that Darryl mentioned earlier. And it comes down to when we have opportunities like this or not, it should be our practice to make sure that that decision-making rooms are diverse and inclusive. And because what happens is we may have, and hear me on this, we may have diversity, but voices need to be listened to. Folks, we don't need women or people of color in the room just to say that women and people of color were in the room. When we enter these spaces, our voices need to be heard, 1. And 2, it's also particularly important that we be willing to welcome into the room voices that might not be necessarily in alignment with what we want to do, right? We have to be welcoming of voices of dissent, because by having voices of dissent, we're able to expose our blind spots. And all too often, we may be willing to invite people into our rooms and into our spaces, but they're our friends, right? We all think the same. So of course we're gonna end up with a great idea. But no, if we want to be better as a city, if we truly want to realize our aspirational potential, then we have to be willing to open up our doors, our rooms to people who might have an opinion, an experience, an idea that's different from what we may want to do. And so I'm hopeful that as we move forward as a city, whether it's creating new neighborhoods or even, quite frankly, in our companies, that we be mindful of not only diversity, but also inclusion, and that includes diversity of opinion as well.
And I hope, just to piggyback on that, that we can have dissenting opinions with grace.
Yes,
Because
absolutely.
don't nobody know how to do that anymore, you know? Excuse my language, but that seems to be missing, that we can't disagree and still stay in the same room. We're not getting the model for that.
And I think that's particularly important too. So there is a way, as my mama says, there's a way to disagree without being disagreeable.
Of course.
But being open again to the diversity in how people present, right? And so, you know, as a Black woman, the way that I may present in a corporate boardroom might be a little bit different than the way a 50-year-old white man may present. And so just being open to that as well, I think, is important. But again, I do want to drive this point home because, you know, while we're talking about the seaport, and the seaport is accessible at this point in time to a very small percentage of us in the city, we have to be mindful of our middle class, our working class, and poor folk in this city. And when we talk about inclusion, we're talking about that part of our community as well.
Absolutely.
I want to make sure that we don't just beat up on the seaport.
Yeah.
We also had another neighborhood that was created in a 3-year span, and that was the Ink Block. Same thing happened there. And now you have the Flower Exchange, which is about to happen. I just hope that the same mistakes that happened in the seaport and also the Ink Block happen over in the Flower Exchange.
Right, okay. Todd Wallach, the data man, the data king, who put all these numbers together, which I think took this series to another level. What was your biggest surprise with any of the numbers that you came up with? Were you?
So one of the numbers getting at isolation is that some places in some ways look even whiter than the Seaport District. If you look at cities and towns across Massachusetts, there are more than a couple dozen with basically 0% of Black residents. The census said there were 0. There's a margin of error, so maybe there were a few the census missed, but that was really striking. We also tried to measure this feeling of isolation and the lack of middle class and upwardly mobile Black communities in other ways. And by the way, there's also not a single city and town in Massachusetts that's majority Black. We're one of the whitest, of the top 10 metro areas, we are the whitest. So some other areas like LA and San Francisco, they might have small Black populations, but they also have smaller white populations and bigger Latino and Asian populations. So here we have this huge divide where it's very easy to go to places like Fenway and find one Black face in a sea of white. I think one of the questions we've gotten was looking at Black enclaves where there are a more significant percentage of Black residents who are doing well. And we tried to set the barriers low. We picked census tracts with just at least 15% of the residents are Black, so not majority, not even close to majority, at least 15%. And where the residents there, the Black residents, earn at least the median income or higher, and at least 30% of them have a bachelor's degree or higher. And we only found 4 census tracts in the Boston area, 4 enclaves, a section of Hyde Park, a section of Milton, and a couple sections of Stoughton. If you looked at white enclaves, it would be something like more than 500. And if we looked at other major metro areas like DC and New York, there were more than 100 enclaves there. And it's a combination of the fact that there is such a small Black population here relative to white, but also the huge economic and social divide. For instance, white households make roughly double what black households make in this area. And the divide is even worse in the Boston area than it is nationwide. So those are really significant factors that contribute to this feeling of isolation, particularly if you're somebody who is doing well or has education and has choices about where you want to live. And so these problems are collectively making it harder to recruit really talented students and really talented doctors and lawyers and other people to the Boston area.
We've got some challenges ahead. What gives you hope?
These conversations, these are real conversations now. And we have people who are in the room who really want to go back and make a change. And the Globe series gave them, I would guess, support to go back into the room and say, we have to do something. And that never existed before. You know, I'm having this conversation on a daily basis in different rooms, and it's just different this time. And I see light. I see light. I see the city rapidly getting ready to put some policies in place. I see the state getting ready to rapidly put some policies in place, and that's what we need, policy changes. And I just want to go back one more time, so if there's anyone here who's a senior person in the private sector, we need your help.
Okay. I want to echo part of what DARRYL said. You know, I've been at the Globe 29 years, writing about race a lot. And I have been really heartened by the reaction to this series. And there's two things in particular. One is that people really want to have this conversation, like all of you here tonight, and thanks for coming. But the other thing is that the reaction to it is much less defensive than it would have been if we'd done this 10 years ago. You know, when you couldn't write about race, believe me, I know, without a lot of pushback. And I think not only do people want to have it, they're ready to have it in a more open way. And people really want to try to begin to find some solutions. And I take a lot from that.
I think part is because you guys put so much ink behind it. If it had been a two-part series, we wouldn't be sitting here right now.
I was going to say, what gives me hope, at the end of the series, we have an email box. People can email us directly, but there's this email that was created, race@globe.com. And so, you know, I will routinely check that. And so this is people who are just writing to the Spotlight team, not necessarily one of us. And I will tell you that I have been really inspired and moved by a lot of the emails I get from people all over. I mean, you know, Andrew just mentioned that one from that sort of 50 and over softball league in the suburbs, but that's just one example. But there are just so many people with such thoughtful things to say about this subject, and I just, you know, and I said this before. Sometimes some people have asked me, well, why do you think people are more or less defensive now? I will say that even though statistically we know the black population hasn't changed that much in sheer numbers or percentage in the last 30 years, you do see more Latino, more Asian people, definitely a significant amount of growth in that way. And I think that there's a younger generation coming in. There's a little more distance between the scars of busing, and maybe because of the greater number of sort of people of color generally, people are more fluent in talking about race, a little less defensive about it. They import different experiences, and it's something that maybe the city is ready in a different way.
That's good.
I also think that the younger population, especially the people of color, are willing to speak up more. They are. And so there was a movie that they showed over at WGBH, and was the history of the historically black colleges. And someone made a comment at the end of the movie was that, you know, the young people made the difference during the civil rights movement, and the young people are going to make a difference when there's income inequality, because they're not going to stand up for it.
Yeah.
And so again, someone talked about, you know, being in the room. It's not enough to be in the room. You know, Dwayne said it wasn't enough to be in the room when it came to Massport, and he spoke up. And Jim Rooney had a diverse board. I see Carol Fopo there. I was on the board. So there were people in the room that said, this is the right thing to do, and we're behind you. So I want to challenge those of color who are here, who are lucky enough to get on those boards that can make a difference. Do not be afraid to speak up.
Speak up, absolutely. I think, absolutely. We're going to take our last question from the internet. What is happening in other cities that is not happening here? I'm assuming that make them move more progressively. Maybe it's that's the way you take it. I don't know. What do you think? Does anybody want to take that one?
The history of, most people have heard the history of Atlanta and the airport and how that happened. So we had a mayor who decided that, that this airport is not going to get built without black people being involved. And he controlled it and ran the city hall with as almost like an iron horse. And every time a developer came in, he said, you know, who's on your team? Is it a diverse team? If the answer was, we don't have an answer for you yet, he would literally say, come back to me when you have a diverse team. So that airport was built with a lot of minority businesses, and a lot of people became millionaires there. And so as a result, there are tons of people that are still in Atlanta today, third generation, that have money, they all know each other, and they do business together. We don't have that here. There's no third generation of black money. There's no third generation of Hispanic money here in Boston. And so we need to build that. And we talk about it being difficult. One of the difficult conversations that we have is that the poor of the minority communities have their set of issues, and then the middle class and the upper middle class of minority communities have their issues. And you can't address them all at the same time. So that's one of the problems that we have behind closed doors and that we're fighting with about how do we work together so everybody can move. Sometimes you got to do it separately, and everybody wants to do it at the same time, and it's just hard to do. It's hard to do it all at the same time. But I will say that the more successful minority businesses that we have, the more brown people will have more money in their pockets, and the more that these neighborhoods will grow and be where everybody wants to live.
I'll tell you one thing that's different from Boston than other cities. We have a more entrenched political power structure. Right. You know, we've had 4 mayors in 50 years. Right. This is something we talked about constantly as we worked on the power story, you know. And one of the things that has to happen is that entrenched, you know, white Irish male power structure has got to begin to give way. Now, I think that is starting to happen. You know, you look at the city council, you look at some of the things that are happening. It is starting to change, but that is one of the ways, I think, in which we tangibly lag behind other cities.
So I want to tag on to, oh.
Go ahead.
I was going to piggyback on Adrian a little bit.
Go ahead.
One of the things that we looked at for the power segment was cities that have smaller black populations than Boston but have had black mayors. Yeah. And Denver has had 2, correct?
Seattle.
Yeah. Seattle. St. Paul just elected a black mayor. Yeah. And I think that you spoke to...
Yeah. I spoke to Wellington Webb, the first black mayor of Denver, and Norm Rice, the first black mayor of Seattle. And they were elected decades ago. They were elected in the 80s, you know? Yeah. So how come that could happen there but not here?
So I do think it's 2, right? It's both. It's the political piece, and, you know, we really do need to explore why it is that in the Commonwealth and across the city of Boston, we've struggled to elect people of color and women. There's something there, and we need to wrestle with that, because what we know is that when we have more inclusion from a political standpoint, then the conversation changes. The policies that are enacted change. The legislation that is pushed changes. And so we have to figure out whether we're going to be satisfied with how our political structures are operating, or if we're willing to do something different to help change the demographics of those who are representing us. That's 1. 2, I also think it's important, you know, from the standpoint of inclusion, to be mindful as a black community that, you know, one of the things that happens in other cities that doesn't happen here, I think, is a sense of community within the black community. And an acknowledgement that the success of one is the success of the other. The failure of one is the failure of another. The lack of opportunity, right? And so whether me having opportunity cannot be enough. And so I absolutely believe that it's important for us to work both ends. It is not enough for me to sit in a seat, in a corporate boardroom transacting deals when I've got the next generation in classrooms that are inadequately funded, or in classrooms where young people are not getting the type of resources they need in order to be prepared to take my spot. And so I do think as a Black community, we also have some work to do around being more inclusive in our conversations, about being more inclusive in the policies that we're driving. It cannot be, I'm sorry, but it can't be, we've got to get the middle class moving before we can address some of the very real issues that are impacting our poor in our community. It has to be both, and that's something that as a Black community we can own.
We struggle with. Well, I want to thank you all for a very powerful conversation. I thank you for your candor. I thank you for your honesty and vulnerability. I think this was good. This was good. I want to remind you that there is a reception across the way here, so downstairs, so we want you all to join us there. And the most importantly, we want you in any way you can to keep the conversation going. Thanks for joining us. God bless you. Good night.